When the German army swept into Poland in September 1939, the city of Lublin quickly found itself transformed into an administrative hub of the general government. For the Nazi occupiers, Lublin was not only centrally located, but it was also close to rail junctions and highways that allowed swift movement of troops, supplies, and, most fatefully, human cargo. The flat fields on the city's outskirts seemed perfect for something new, something the SS was only beginning to envision. A vast complex where thousands of prisoners could be contained, exploited, and ultimately erased. Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer SS, understood that the Eastern territories offered both opportunity and challenge. Poland's educated classes had to be suppressed, resistance was rising, and millions of Soviet prisoners of war were expected once Operation Barbarossa began. In July 1941, Himmler visited Lublin personally, accompanied by Odilo Globocnik, the Austrian-born SS and police leader, who had already developed a reputation for ruthless efficiency. It was during this visit that Himmler gave the order to construct a large prisoner-of-war camp. Globocnik was tasked with overseeing the project. Few knew it then, but this camp, initially conceived as a holding pen for captured Red Army soldiers, would become Majdanek, one of the most infamous sites of mass murder in human history. Construction began in October 1941 on a stretch of open land just 3 miles from Lublin's city centre. Officially, it was to be a Kriegsgefangenenlager, a POW camp designed to hold up to 25,000 Soviet prisoners. The logic seemed sound to the German planners. Tens of thousands of Red Army soldiers were expected to be captured, and the Nazis had no intention of feeding them or providing humane shelter. The site was chosen for practical reasons: its proximity to rail lines, its relative isolation from major urban centres, and the availability of local forced labour. Polish civilians and Jewish prisoners were drafted to build the first barracks, driving posts into the cold soil, erecting fences and laying down planks for what would become a city of barbed wire. But the design, hastily drawn up in SS offices, was riddled with flaws. The barracks were cheaply constructed wooden huts, uninsulated and draughty, inadequate for Poland's freezing winters. Barbed wire was strung up quickly, but much of it sagged, leaving guards frustrated at the potential for escapes. Watchtowers were placed irregularly, offering poor lines of sight. Even before the first transports arrived, the camp's commanders were complaining about shortages of building material, food, and manpower. Yet the SS pressed ahead, convinced that improvisation would suffice. After all, the prisoners were not meant to survive long. By November 1941, the first groups of Soviet POWs were marched into the half-finished camp. Exhausted from long transports in sealed boxcars, they stumbled onto the muddy grounds only to find incomplete barracks and no proper sanitation. They were forced to sleep on straw, often without blankets, exposed to wind and snow. The German guards gave them little food, sometimes only a piece of bread and watery soup per day. Disease spread quickly. Typhus, carried by lice, tore through the camp that winter, killing thousands. German records later showed that within months the original Soviet prisoner intake had been decimated. But the camp did not remain solely a site for Soviet POWs. By early 1942, the war and Nazi racial policy were accelerating in new directions. In January of that year, the Wannsee conference in Berlin formalized the final solution. Globocnik, already commanding SS operations in Lublin, was entrusted with the implementation of Operation Reinhard, the code name for the systematic extermination of Poland's Jews. Majdanek, though originally designed as a prisoner camp, was quickly absorbed into this machinery of death. Its capacity was expanded to hold Jews deported from across occupied Poland, as well as Poles arrested for resistance, intellectuals, and Roma families. The early prisoner groups reflected the Nazi worldview. Soviet soldiers were deemed subhuman Bolsheviks, fit only to be worked to death. Polish intellectuals, priests, teachers, and community leaders were swept up in roundups meant to cripple national identity. Jews were targeted simply for existing, marked for eventual extermination. In this grim mixture, Majdanek became a microcosm of Nazi racial policy, a place of exploitation, terror, and annihilation. Life in those first months was defined by hunger and abuse. Prisoners rose before dawn to the sound of whistles and barking dogs, lining up in endless roll calls that could last for hours in freezing temperatures. Work details sent them to dig ditches, carry stones, or build new barracks for incoming transports. Guards beat prisoners indiscriminately, often for failing to stand straight or for collapsing from exhaustion. Food rations were deliberately insufficient. A thin soup of turnips, a crust of black bread, sometimes a sliver of margarine. Malnutrition weakened bodies, and disease finished what hunger began. Survivors would later recall that corpses piled up daily, stacked outside barracks until carts could haul them away. The design flaws of the camp added to the misery. Mud clung to boots and clothing, and drainage was poor, leaving barracks surrounded by pools of stagnant water. Sanitary facilities were crude, with open latrines that froze in winter and overflowed in spring. The stench was overpowering, and lice infestations made delousing nearly impossible. The SS showed no interest in improving conditions, since prisoner deaths were expected. In fact, starvation and disease were seen as efficient tools of control. By early 1942, Majdanek already held several thousand inmates, a grim population of Soviet soldiers, Poles, Jews, and others deemed enemies of the Reich. Rumours circulated among prisoners that worse was to come. They did not yet know that Majdanek would soon gain gas chambers and crematoria, or that it would become one of the central sites of the Holocaust. But even in its earliest phase, the camp revealed the lethal combination of Nazi ideology and administrative neglect. Designed in haste, built poorly, and run with calculated brutality, Majdanek was from its very inception a place where survival was nearly impossible. What set Majdanek apart, however, was not just its brutality, but its visibility. Located so close to Lublin, with watchtowers rising above the fields, local civilians could not ignore its presence. They saw the endless convoys of prisoners marching through the streets, the smoke from mass burnings, the trains rattling in and out. The Germans had chosen Lublin for its strategic position, but in doing so they placed their killing ground in plain sight. That decision would later prove fateful. Unlike Treblinka or Sobibor, designed to vanish after their work was done, Majdanek could never be hidden so easily. By the spring of 1942, Majdanek had already begun its transformation from a crude POW camp into something far darker. What began with Soviet prisoners stumbling into unfinished barracks would soon expand into an industrialized system of mass killing. The harsh conditions, the flawed design, the brutal SS guards, these were only the foundations. The machinery of death was only just beginning to turn. By the beginning of 1942, the camp at Lublin was no longer just a holding site for Soviet prisoners of war. Decisions made in Berlin would soon transform it into something altogether more sinister. On January 20th, 1942, at a villa on the outskirts of Berlin, senior Nazi officials gathered for what became known as the Wannsee Conference. Chaired by Reinhard Heydrich, the meeting formally outlined the final solution of the Jewish question. Europe's Jews, estimated at 11 million, were to be systematically exterminated. Though Himmler and Heydrich provided the ideological framework, the practical execution was entrusted to regional commanders. In the general government of occupied Poland, this responsibility fell to Odilo Globocnik, Himmler's trusted subordinate in Lublin. Globocnik had already proven his ruthlessness during the resettlement actions in the Lublin district. Now he was given a new mission, to oversee Operation Reinhard, the codename for the extermination program that would establish 3 primary death camps, Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. Majdanek, though not originally conceived as a Reinhard camp, became a crucial part of the system. Its location in Lublin made it the logistical hub for Globocnik's administration, and its existing infrastructure, barracks, fences, and guard towers, could easily be expanded. Unlike the secret killing centres in remote forests, Majdanek was meant to serve multiple functions: forced labour, prisoner internment, and mass extermination. By early 1942, its evolution from POW camp to death camp was well underway. The transformation began with construction. Prisoner labour gangs were forced to build additional barracks, double rows of barbed wire, and new watchtowers. SS engineers designed and oversaw the installation of permanent killing facilities. By the spring of 1942, the first gas chambers were operational. Unlike the specially built carbon monoxide engines at Belzec, the chambers at Majdanek were primitive, but effective. Some used carbon monoxide piped in from cylinders. Others used Zyklon B, the cyanide-based pesticide already employed at Auschwitz. Prisoners were told they were being sent to showers. Once the steel doors slammed shut, the pellets were dropped or the gas turned on. Within minutes, hundreds suffocated. The dead were hauled out by fellow prisoners, who were forced to strip the bodies of clothing, shoes, and valuables, before dragging them to mass graves or makeshift cremation pits. In 1943, as crematoria were installed, the corpses were burned instead. The stench carried across Lublin, a constant reminder of what was happening behind the camp's fences. Daily life for those not immediately gassed was scarcely less lethal. Prisoners were divided into categories: Jews, Polish political prisoners, Soviet POWs, Roma, and others the Nazis considered undesirable. Each group wore a coloured triangle on their striped uniforms: yellow for Jews, red for political prisoners, green for criminals, purple for Jehovah's Witnesses, black for so-called asocials. This system of categorization determined work details, punishments, and chances of survival. Jews fared worst, often sent directly to the gas chambers or assigned to backbreaking labour intended to kill them slowly. Food was starvation level by design. Rations often consisted of watery soup with potato peelings, a scrap of bread, and rarely a sliver of margarine. Medical care was non-existent. Disease spread unchecked: typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis. SS guards treated illness as weakness, often beating or shooting those too sick to stand during roll call. A single infraction, stealing food, speaking out of turn, collapsing from exhaustion, could mean death. Testimonies from survivors describe Majdanek as a place of constant fear and random cruelty. Prisoners might be beaten to death with rifle butts or truncheons. Women recalled being stripped, shaved, and subjected to humiliations designed to break them psychologically. Children were torn from parents, often sent directly to gas chambers or left to starve. Prisoner labour was exploited for projects that supported the German war machine: digging ditches, building roads, repairing uniforms for the Wehrmacht. Globocnik envisioned Majdanek as both a killing site and an economic asset. One of the camp's most notorious features was its execution site. Prisoners were sometimes marched to ditches outside the camp, forced to kneel and shot in the back of the head. Mass shootings claimed thousands of lives before the gas chambers became the primary method of extermination. German records, cross-referenced with post-war interrogations, estimate that by the end of 1942, tens of thousands had already perished in Majdanek. The psychological environment of the camp was one of calculated terror. Guards were rotated frequently, and many were recruited from the SS Totenkopfverbände, men already seasoned in brutality. Yet not all violence came from Germans. The SS relied heavily on prisoner functionaries, or kapos, to enforce discipline. Often drawn from criminal prisoners, kapos wielded sticks or whips, relishing the small measure of power granted to them. Survivors remembered them as nearly as feared as the SS themselves. Meanwhile, the Nazis treated Majdanek's output with bureaucratic precision. Belongings taken from murdered Jews were sorted in warehouses. Mountains of shoes, eyeglasses, clothing, and even hair were shipped to Germany for reuse. German clerks kept meticulous records of gold fillings extracted from corpses, weighing and cataloguing them before sending them to the Reichsbank. In these inventories, the human beings of Majdanek were reduced to commodities. For the SS administration, the camp was both a killing site and a logistical hub. Deportation trains carrying Jews from across Poland and later from Western Europe frequently passed through Lublin. Some transports were sent on to Treblinka or Sobibor. Others were unloaded at Majdanek itself. Here, selection determined who would be gassed immediately and who would be worked to death. The average life expectancy for those chosen for labour was measured in weeks. The growing scale of death was staggering. By mid-1942, Majdanek's population swelled to over 40,000. Thousands died every month. Yet unlike the isolated Reinhard camps, Majdanek was located in plain sight. Locals in Lublin saw transports arrive. They saw the smoke. Some collaborated with the Germans, profiting from confiscated goods or betraying Jews in hiding. Others tried to help, smuggling food to prisoners or passing information to the Polish underground. But the camp loomed over the city, an unspoken terror impossible to ignore. Even within this atmosphere of hopelessness, small acts of defiance emerged. Prisoners organized secret prayers, shared smuggled news from the outside world, or carved tiny memorials for loved ones lost. These fragile gestures of humanity stood in stark contrast to the mechanized inhumanity of the SS. By the end of 1942, Majdanek had fully joined the network of extermination. The crude camp erected for Soviet POWs had become a vast killing center equipped with gas chambers and crematoria. Its daily function was no longer ambiguous. It was a place where thousands were systematically destroyed, their lives erased, their possessions stolen, their bodies disposed of with bureaucratic efficiency. The shift was complete. Majdanek was no longer merely a camp of hardship and forced labour. It was now a cornerstone in the Nazi project of annihilation. Operation Reinhard, under Globocnik's direction, had turned the fields outside Lublin into one of the most visible sites of the Holocaust. And unlike the secret camps hidden in forests, Majdanek's horror unfolded in the open, its watchtowers, fences and plumes of smoke casting a shadow that the world would not be able to ignore. By the spring of 1942, Majdanek had already claimed hundreds of lives through hunger, disease and brutality, but the camp was only beginning to reveal its true purpose. What had started as an improvised prisoner of war compound on the outskirts of Lublin now entered a new phase, one driven not by neglect or incompetence, but by the deliberate machinery of state-sponsored extermination. The transformation was orchestrated under the authority of Heinrich Himmler's office and his trusted lieutenant in the general government, Odilo Globocnik. Globocnik, the SS and police leader of the Lublin district, had by this time been placed in charge of Action Reinhard, the secret Nazi plan to annihilate the Jews of occupied Poland. Belzec, Sobibor and Treblinka were purpose-built killing centres under his command. Yet Majdanek, already standing near the industrial hub of Lublin, was too useful to ignore. Unlike the Reinhard camps, which were designed solely for rapid murder, Majdanek would serve multiple functions at once: a concentration camp, a forced labour depot, and increasingly, a killing ground. In July 1942, Himmler visited Lublin personally. His directives were blunt. Majdanek, still under construction in many areas, was to be expanded to house 50,000 prisoners, later raised to 150,000. The original vision of a temporary POW camp dissolved. Barracks multiplied, perimeter fences were extended, and new sections carved into the landscape. SS engineers introduced a layout of multiple fields, each with rows of wooden huts, guard towers and barbed wire. The camp became a city of death, methodically organised for containment, exploitation and annihilation. Construction relied heavily on forced labour itself. Prisoners built their own barracks, dug their own latrines, and laid the foundations of the crematoria that would later devour their bodies. Starvation diets and beatings ensured that many did not live long enough to see their work finished, only to be replaced by new arrivals funnelled in from across occupied Poland. By the second half of 1942, Majdanek became a destination for Jews deported from ghettos throughout the region. Transports from Lublin itself were among the first, but soon came trains from Warsaw, Krakow, and as far away as Slovakia and Germany. For many, Majdanek was not the final stop, but a holding pen, a sorting station in the Nazi system of destruction, yet thousands were murdered here outright. Eyewitness testimony describes how new arrivals were driven from the railway spur into the camp, stripped of possessions, and crammed into overcrowded barracks. The air grew thick with disease. Typhus swept through the camp repeatedly, killing indiscriminately. The SS, fearing epidemic, sometimes ordered mass shootings of infected prisoners, an efficient solution to a problem of their own creation. Unlike Belzec or Treblinka, Majdanek was not built exclusively as a death camp, but in 1942 it acquired the same instruments of mass killing. In the northern section of the camp, concrete chambers were outfitted with airtight doors. These were the gas chambers, primitive but lethal. Here, Zyklon B pellets or carbon monoxide gas were introduced, depending on availability. Victims were locked inside, their screams muffled by the walls as guards watched through peepholes until silence fell. The first experiments with Zyklon B in Majdanek mirrored similar killings at Auschwitz. Prisoners, mostly Jews, were driven into the chambers under the pretext of delousing. Instead, they suffocated in agony. Survivors later recalled the bitter almond smell, the confusion and the terror, as families realized too late what awaited them. The killings could involve dozens at a time, sometimes hundreds, their bodies piled together in grotesque contortions. Gas chambers at Majdanek were smaller than those at Treblinka or Sobibor, but their symbolism was immense. They revealed that Majdanek had crossed a threshold. It was no longer only a site of incarceration and forced labour, but also a node in the extermination system. Parallel to mass killings, Majdanek was harnessed as a reservoir of human labour. Himmler envisioned Lublin as an industrial hub supplying the German war machine. Workshops inside the camp produced boots, uniforms and equipment. Prisoners stitched clothing stripped from murdered Jews, their labour feeding back into the system that was destroying them. SS-run companies contracted forced labour to German firms. Prisoners were sent to work in nearby quarries, construction projects or factories, often under lethal conditions. Exhaustion was deliberate. Prisoners were considered expendable, a resource to be used up. In one chilling SS directive, inmates were described as consumables to be managed for maximum efficiency. By early 1943, Majdanek's dual role as labour camp and extermination site created staggering death tolls. Estimates suggest that tens of thousands of Jews were murdered in gas chambers or shootings during this period, while thousands more perished from hunger and disease. Soviet prisoners of war, Polish resistance members, and others labelled enemies of the Reich joined them in the mass graves. The crematorium, completed in 1943, made disposal more efficient. Its ovens burned day and night, filling the sky with the stench of human ash. When fuel was scarce, bodies were burned in open-air pyres. Local residents in Lublin later testified that they could see and smell the fires from miles away. The camp was not hidden deep in a forest like Treblinka. It stood on the city's edge, a constant reminder to the Polish population of Nazi power and terror. Beyond physical extermination, the SS wielded psychological cruelty as a weapon. Public hangings, beatings, and executions instilled constant fear. prisoners were forced to witness their comrades' deaths. Guards carried out arbitrary killings for sport, shooting into barracks, setting dogs on prisoners, or drowning them in puddles. Survivor testimonies emphasize the atmosphere of randomness. Death could come not only from starvation or disease, but from a guard's whim. This climate of terror served a purpose. It broke resistance, ensuring prisoners remained obedient while their bodies and labour were consumed by the machinery of the camp. By the end of 1943, Majdanek had become one of the largest concentration camps in Europe. Though overshadowed by Auschwitz in scale, it stood as a central pillar of the Nazi occupation in Poland. Its proximity to Lublin meant its existence was no secret to locals, and its function was increasingly visible to the outside world. Allied intelligence began receiving reports of atrocities, though the full scope was not yet understood. Majdanek's expansion marked a dark turning point. What had begun as a crude prisoner compound for Soviet captives was now a vast complex of labour, suffering, and mass death, an essential component of the Nazi vision for Eastern Europe. Its gas chambers, barracks, and crematoria foreshadowed the immense crimes that would later come fully to light. Yet in 1942 and 1943, the world remained largely unaware, even as the machinery of death ground relentlessly on at the edge of Lublin. By the beginning of 1944, the tide of war had turned decisively against Nazi Germany. The Red Army was advancing relentlessly westward, retaking swaths of Ukraine and pushing toward the Vistula River. Lublin, situated on a strategic axis of advance, lay directly in the path of Soviet offensives. Majdanek, once seen as a secure site deep in the general government, was suddenly vulnerable. The camp authorities scrambled to respond. Orders from Berlin and the SS main economic and administrative office demanded that evidence of mass murder be destroyed. This mirrored the wider Sonderaktion 1005, in which the Nazis attempted to exhume and incinerate bodies at killing sites across the east. At Majdanek, this effort was chaotic. Prisoners were forced to dig up mass graves from Action Erntefest and burn corpses on makeshift pyres. The stench was overpowering, lingering over Lublin for weeks. Yet the pace of Soviet advance meant there was no time for thorough concealment. In the spring of 1944, the SS began transferring prisoners out of Majdanek to camps deeper inside the Reich, especially Auschwitz, Gross-Rosen, and Ravensbrück. Long columns of emaciated men and women, escorted by guards, trudged toward railway stations. Many perished during these forced evacuations. The camp's population fluctuated wildly, shrinking as transports left, swelling again when new prisoners arrived from liquidated ghettos or partisan sweeps. Conditions inside Majdanek grew even harsher. With resources diverted to the collapsing German war effort, rations were cut further. Diseases such as typhus spread unchecked. Starvation claimed hundreds each week. The crematoria operated day and night, yet still could not keep up with the number of dead. By July 1944, the Soviet summer offensive had shattered German lines. Operation Bagration destroyed Army Group Center, and Soviet spearheads surged into eastern Poland. Panic gripped the German administration in Lublin. The SS at Majdanek received orders to abandon the camp. In haste, they set fire to warehouses filled with confiscated clothing, shoes, and personal belongings of murdered victims. Columns of smoke rose high into the sky, visible for miles, a black signal of retreat and destruction. On July 22, 1944, the Germans began evacuating the last prisoners. Yet the withdrawal was disorganized and incomplete. Many guards fled outright, deserting their posts. A skeleton staff remained, trying desperately to complete the destruction of records and facilities. But it was too late. On July 23rd, Soviet troops of the 2nd Tank Army entered Lublin. Expecting to find only ruins, they instead stumbled upon Majdanek, largely intact. Unlike Treblinka, Sobibor, or Belzec, which had been dismantled months earlier, Majdanek was abandoned in such haste that its infrastructure survived. The barbed wire fences, guard towers, gas chambers, and crematoria all remained standing. Inside, thousands of prisoners still languished, Poles, Jews, and Soviet POWs, too weak to be evacuated. For them, liberation had come suddenly, almost unbelievably. The Red Army was stunned. Soviet war correspondents and camera crews entered the camp within days. They documented what they found: piles of ashes and bone fragments near the crematoria, hundreds of thousands of shoes in storage barracks, gas chambers with blue-stained walls from Zyklon B. Prisoners' testimonies were recorded immediately. The evidence of mass murder was overwhelming, irrefutable. The discovery of Majdanek shocked the world. It was the first major concentration and extermination camp liberated by Allied forces, months before the liberation of Auschwitz. Journalists from across the globe toured the site under Soviet supervision. Photographs of the crematoria, gas chambers, and surviving inmates appeared in newspapers from London to New York. Headlines described Majdanek as the factory of death. The Nazis had insisted the camp was a labour facility, but the truth lay bare. Documents captured in the camp offices confirmed the scale of operations. Testimonies from survivors spoke of gas chambers disguised as showers, of children torn from their mothers, of the November 1943 massacre. The warehouses of belongings revealed the extent of plunder: tens of thousands of shoes, coats, and household items stripped from victims. Initial estimates of the death toll were staggering. Soviet and Polish investigators claimed 1.5 million people had been murdered at Majdanek, a figure later revised downward by Western historians, but shocking nonetheless. Today, based on post-war research and captured German records, the accepted number is approximately 78,000 victims, around 59,000 Jews and 19,000 non-Jews, including Poles, Soviet POWs, and Roma. Even with lower numbers, the scale of atrocity placed Majdanek among the most notorious of Nazi camps. For the survivors, liberation was bittersweet. Many were skeletal, their bodies broken by months or years of starvation and disease. Few had families left to return to. Some wept openly when Soviet soldiers entered, others were too numb to react. Liberation brought freedom, but it also forced confrontation with unbearable loss. The Allies seized on Majdanek as proof of Nazi barbarism. At the Nuremberg trials, photographs and testimonies from the camp were used to demonstrate crimes against humanity. Unlike Treblinka or Sobibor, where almost no physical structures survived, Majdanek's intact gas chambers and crematoria stood as undeniable evidence. The Nazis' attempt to erase their crimes had failed spectacularly. For the city of Lublin, Majdanek became a permanent scar. Residents who had lived in its shadow could no longer deny what had occurred. The smoke that had risen from its chimneys, the columns of prisoners marched through the streets, the faint screams and gunshots, all became pieces of a horrifying puzzle. The camp's proximity to the city made its crimes impossible to ignore. Today, Majdanek endures as one of the most complete Holocaust memorials in Europe. Visitors walk through barracks, stand in the gas chambers, and view the massive mound of human ashes preserved as a monument. It remains a chilling reminder of how industrialized murder operated in plain sight of an occupied city. The liberation of Majdanek was not merely the end of a camp, it was the moment the world could no longer look away. The attempt to hide the Holocaust had collapsed with the German front lines. In July 1944, near Lublin, the veil was torn away, and humanity was confronted with the machinery of death it was never supposed to see. The liberation of Majdanek in July 1944 marked a watershed moment in global awareness of Nazi crimes. For the first time, the machinery of extermination was revealed intact. Gas chambers, crematoria, mass graves, and warehouses brimming with the belongings of the dead. Unlike Treblinka or Sobibor, which had been dismantled in secrecy, Majdanek's hurried abandonment made it undeniable. What the Nazis had hoped to conceal was now visible to the world. In the immediate aftermath, Soviet authorities staged tours for journalists and delegations. Photographs of the ovens and heaps of shoes were printed across Europe and America. The Associated Press ran dispatches describing a veritable factory of death. For many, these images were the first concrete proof that the rumours of mass extermination were not wild propaganda, but harsh truth. Yet, in the West, some initial scepticism lingered. The sheer scale of the crimes was difficult to comprehend, and wartime distrust of Soviet sources led some to question the numbers. Even so, Majdanek planted the first seeds of recognition of the Holocaust as a unique crime against humanity. For survivors, reckoning was personal and immediate. Many testified to Soviet investigators within days of liberation, recounting scenes of gas chambers disguised as showers, children torn from parents, and corpses burned in open pits. Their words, preserved in early depositions, became part of the historical record. Yet survival itself carried burdens. Most had lost entire families, and returning to pre-war lives was often impossible. Displacement, trauma, and grief became their lasting companions. In post-war Poland, Majdanek quickly assumed symbolic importance. By 1947, the Polish government declared the site a state museum, one of the first Holocaust memorials in Europe. Unlike Auschwitz, which was liberated later and became internationally iconic, Majdanek was initially framed through a broader lens of Nazi crimes against Polish citizens as well as Jews. This reflected both political narratives of the new communist regime and the camp's diverse victim population. Over time, however, the specifically Jewish tragedy at Majdanek was more fully acknowledged, particularly in the context of Action Erntefest, the single largest one-day massacre of Jews during the Holocaust. Internationally, Majdanek figured prominently in the Nuremberg trials. Photographs of its gas chambers and crematoria were introduced as evidence. Eyewitness testimony confirmed the deliberate nature of mass extermination. Although the precise number of victims remained contested, Soviet investigators initially estimated 1.5 million, while later research established the number at approximately 78,000. The moral weight of Majdanek's existence was undeniable. It stood as a monument to the fusion of ideology, bureaucracy, and industrial murder. For decades, Majdanek's memory bore traces of Cold War politics. In the West, Auschwitz became the dominant symbol of the Holocaust, while Majdanek, under Soviet control, was often presented as evidence of German fascism without always acknowledging the centrality of Jewish suffering. Still, survivors' memoirs, oral histories, and scholarly research gradually restored its place in the broader Holocaust narrative. Today, Majdanek remains one of the most haunting preserved sites of Nazi atrocity. Visitors walk through barracks, see the preserved crematoria, and confront the massive mausoleum containing the ashes of victims. Unlike other camps where reconstruction was necessary, Majdanek's authenticity lies in its survival. Standing at the edge of Lublin, it is impossible to ignore the proximity of death to ordinary life. The chimneys once belching smoke in sight of city residents, the cries of prisoners carried on the wind. The reckoning with Majdanek continues across generations. It challenges the world not only to remember the dead, but to confront the mechanisms of hatred and indifference that made such a camp possible. Its preservation resists denial and distortion. It insists on truth, even when the numbers are revised, the interpretations debated, and memory contested. In the end, Majdanek's story is not merely about the machinery of death, but about humanity's confrontation with its darkest capacities. It was the death camp the world was never supposed to see, yet it was seen, and because it was seen, it cannot be forgotten. The story of Majdanek did not end with its liberation, or even with the first wave of trials and memorialization. Its significance has grown across decades, not simply as a preserved site of Nazi atrocity, but as a warning about the fragility of civilization itself. To walk through Majdanek today is to move through a paradox. a place of silence where tens of thousands died, yet also a place that speaks constantly to those willing to listen. One of the most enduring lessons of Majdanek lies in its visibility. Unlike camps hidden in remote forests, Majdanek stood at the edge of a major city. From the streets of Lublin, local residents could see the barbed wire, the watchtowers, even the smoke rising from the crematoria. Prisoner columns marched through city streets to forced labour sites. The sounds of gunfire carried beyond the camp fence. While locals may not have known every detail of the atrocities inside, they could not entirely look away. The presence of Majdanek reveals a chilling truth. Genocide can exist in plain sight, normalizing itself in the shadow of everyday life. Another lesson emerges from the camp's dual function. Majdanek was both a labour facility and an extermination site, where prisoners were worked to death even as others were gassed upon arrival. This hybrid nature reflected the Nazis' evolving policies, combining the exploitation of forced labour with the ideological drive for annihilation. The coexistence of industrial workshops and gas chambers illustrates how economic utility and genocidal ideology fed into each other, each reinforcing the other's logic. Evil was not an aberration, it was embedded into the systems of production, paperwork, and military necessity. The legal reckoning with Majdanek was uneven but groundbreaking. In 1944, before the war had even ended, Polish and Soviet authorities organized the Majdanek trials in Lublin, where several SS guards and staff members were prosecuted. These early proceedings predated Nuremberg and set precedents for war crimes accountability. Yet justice was incomplete. Many of Majdanek's perpetrators escaped trial, lived quiet post-war lives in Germany or Austria, or faced only lenient sentences decades later. The slow pursuit of justice raises uncomfortable questions about how societies deal with mass atrocity. Does time dilute responsibility? Can there ever be true justice for crimes of such magnitude? Majdanek forces these questions into the open. Memory itself has been contested. During the communist era, narratives about Majdanek emphasized anti-fascist struggle and Polish martyrdom, sometimes downplaying the centrality of Jewish victims. After 1989, with the fall of the Iron Curtain, new research and open archives reshaped understanding. Jewish suffering, particularly the mass shootings of Action Erntefest, became central in historical scholarship and commemoration. This shift reminds us that memory is never static. It is shaped by politics, culture, and the moral demands of each generation. Yet Majdanek's lessons are not only about the past, they reverberate in the present. The camp's preservation confronts visitors with urgent questions about how societies respond to hatred and violence today. When one stands inside a gas chamber still stained by Zyklon B, or gazes at the mound of human ashes preserved in the mausoleum, the message is not abstract. It is visceral. It warns that indifference, prejudice, and bureaucratic obedience can lead to unthinkable consequences. Survivors of Majdanek often framed their testimonies as warnings. "We tell these stories so that the world will not repeat them," many said in later years. Their voices, recorded in memoirs, interviews, and courtroom testimony, carry an ethical weight beyond historical fact. They remind us that each statistic, 78,000 dead at Majdanek, 18,000 in a single day during Erntefest, is not an anonymous number but a sum of lives. Children who laughed, parents who worked, communities that flourished. Genocide seeks to erase individuality. Memory seeks to restore it. Education has become central to Majdanek's legacy. Thousands of students, teachers, and researchers visit the camp each year. Exhibits display not only the machinery of death but also artifacts of life. Letters smuggled by prisoners, drawings, personal belongings. These fragments humanize the victims, bridging the gap between past and present. The museum's role is not only to document but also to provoke reflection. How do we recognize the signs of dehumanization in our own time? What responsibilities do we bear when hatred resurfaces in public life? The symbolic power of Majdanek also lies in its incompleteness. Unlike Auschwitz, where massive memorial complexes frame the experience, Majdanek feels stark, almost abrupt. Barracks still stand with decaying bunks. The crematoria are preserved but not rebuilt. The silence is broken only by wind across the fields. This authenticity is part of its force. It does not offer a neatly curated story. It presents the raw reality, leaving visitors to confront what remains and what was lost. Internationally, Majdanek continues to be a touchstone in Holocaust studies. Scholars debate its role within Operation Reinhard, its connections to forced labour economies, and its impact on Polish-Jewish relations during the war. At academic conferences and memorial events, Majdanek is invoked as a reminder of the Holocaust's complexity. It was not only industrialized murder, but also daily brutality, hunger, disease, and humiliation. Perhaps the most sobering lesson of Majdanek is that the world was never supposed to see it. The camp was intended to be erased, its victims consumed by fire and ash, its land repurposed. That it survived was an accident of war, German retreat too hurried, Soviet advance too fast. In this accident lies both tragedy and hope. Tragedy, because tens of thousands perished before liberation came. Hope, because their suffering was not fully hidden. The world was forced to confront what human beings had done to one another in the name of ideology and power. As the years pass, fewer survivors remain to bear witness. The responsibility shifts to historians, educators, and ordinary visitors. To walk through Majdanek is to inherit the duty of memory. It is to stand in a place where silence speaks, where absence is presence, where the unseen becomes seen. The lesson of Majdanek is not only about the past, it is a warning etched into the present. What begins with words of hatred can end with fields of ash. The story of Majdanek is more than dates, figures, and administrative orders. It is, at its core, the story of people, those who perished, those who endured, and those who bore witness after liberation. Without their voices, the camp would remain only a skeletal structure of barbed wire and barracks. With them, Majdanek becomes a chorus of humanity, pleading not to be forgotten. In the months immediately following liberation, Soviet and Polish investigators recorded testimony from survivors. These early accounts were stark, unadorned, and often fragmented, shaped by trauma that was still raw. One survivor, a Polish political prisoner, described watching transports arrive at the camp. The children clung to their mothers. Some cried, some were silent. The guards shouted, beat them, drove them forward. Later I learned they were taken to the showers. None returned. Such testimony cut through the fog of war with devastating clarity. Jewish survivors, though few in number, left some of the most searing accounts. Many had been forced to endure the November 1943 Action Erntefest. One remembered, "The earth moved after the shooting. I saw it with my own eyes. The pits were so full that some who were only wounded clawed their way upward. The Germans shot them again, laughing." These words, written in post-war affidavits, captured not only the brutality but also the surreal horror of death on such a scale. Children, too, bore witness. Those who survived were rare, but their memories carried particular poignancy. A boy from Zamość, deported with his family, later recalled, "I was hungry always. I remember stealing a potato from the ground and being beaten for it. My mother died of sickness. I do not remember her face, only that she held my hand until the end." In such fragments of memory, entire worlds of loss are contained. Not all testimonies came from victims. Some were from perpetrators, captured after the war and interrogated by Allied authorities. These accounts, cold and matter-of-fact, confirmed the survivors' stories in chilling detail. A former SS guard admitted, "Yes, there were gas chambers. Prisoners were told they were going to be disinfected. We locked the doors, released the Zyklon B. After 15 minutes, we opened the chamber. The bodies were blue. We dragged them to the crematorium. His detached tone underscored the bureaucratic efficiency with which mass murder was carried out. Testimonies also came from ordinary Polish citizens who lived in Lublin during the war. Some confessed they had seen prisoners marched through the streets, their eyes sunken, their bodies skeletal. Others admitted they smelled the stench of burning flesh from the crematoria. A farmer living nearby told investigators, "The smoke never stopped. We knew what it was, though we did not speak of it. We were afraid these words highlighted the atmosphere of terror and silence that allowed the camp to operate in plain sight." As decades passed, survivor testimony became not only evidence, but also an act of moral resistance. In the 1960s and 1970s, as Holocaust denial emerged in some circles, former prisoners gave public lectures, wrote memoirs, and spoke to students. Their memories were often imperfect. Trauma distorts detail, but their truth was undeniable. Each survivor became a custodian of memory, carrying the burden of representing those who could no longer speak. One of the most powerful testimonies came from Halina Birnbaum, a Polish Jew deported to Majdanek as a teenager. In her memoirs, she wrote, "I lived through Majdanek, but I did not leave it behind. It lives in me always. The barbed wire, the hunger, the smoke. Even in freedom, I am still there." Her words reflect the enduring psychological imprisonment survivors carried long after the physical fences were torn down. Testimonies also shaped justice. At the Nuremberg trials, photographs of Majdanek were paired with survivor accounts to prove crimes against humanity. Later, during the 1970s Majdanek trials in Düsseldorf, Germany, dozens of witnesses described the atrocities in harrowing detail. Some survivors faced their former tormentors across the courtroom. One Polish woman testified, "I remember his face. He beat my father until he collapsed. My father never rose again." I will never forget her statement delivered decades later was both evidence and accusation. The act of remembering was itself a form of survival. In displaced persons' camps after the war, former inmates of Majdanek gathered to share their stories. They compiled lists of the dead, reconstructed fragments of lost communities, and tried to preserve traditions annihilated by the Nazis. Testimony became a way of resisting erasure. Each story told was a refusal to let the victims vanish into statistics. Yet testimony also revealed the difficulty of memory. Some survivors could not speak for years. The horror was too immense, the grief too raw. Others spoke only in fragments, unable to convey the full weight of what they had endured. Silence, too, became a form of testimony, an acknowledgement that some experiences defied language. In the present day, oral history projects have preserved hundreds of Majdanek testimonies. Digital archives store video interviews, allowing future generations to see the faces and hear the voices of survivors. A trembling hand, a breaking voice, a pause before describing a scene of unimaginable cruelty. These nuances communicate truths that written words alone cannot. Testimonies also remind us that memory is not uniform. Survivors remembered different aspects of the camp depending on their age, background, and circumstances. Some recalled the humiliation of being stripped and shaved upon arrival. Others remembered the sound of boots on gravel, or the taste of watery soup, or the smell of burning flesh. Each perspective adds a layer to the collective memory of Majdanek. The living memory of Majdanek is also carried by the descendants of survivors. Children and grandchildren often speak of growing up with shadows, stories half told, silences heavy with unspoken pain. For many, visiting Majdanek has been an act of reclaiming history, of walking the ground where their ancestors suffered, and of ensuring that their voices echo across time. In this way, the testimonies of the lost and the living intertwine. The dead left behind no voices, only ashes and belongings. The living carried the duty to speak for them. Together, their voices form a chorus that resists denial, forgetfulness, and indifference. They transform Majdanek from a site of silence into a place of moral reckoning. Ultimately, testimony is not only about remembering the past, it is about shaping the future. To listen to survivors of Majdanek is to confront the depths of human cruelty and the resilience of human spirit. It is to be reminded that genocide does not begin with gas chambers, but with words, policies, and prejudices tolerated too long. It is to accept the responsibility of memory, so that the world never again allows such horrors to unfold unseen. By the summer of 1944, the tides of war had turned decisively against Germany. The Red Army was advancing westward at breathtaking speed, driving through Ukraine and into eastern Poland. German defences, weakened by years of attrition, were collapsing. For Majdanek, perched on the outskirts of Lublin, the end came with startling speed, an ending that shocked the world. Unlike Auschwitz, Treblinka, or Sobibor, Majdanek was not fully dismantled before the Allies arrived. The speed of the Soviet advance in July 1944 caught the Germans off guard, leaving behind a functioning concentration and extermination camp, complete with barracks, gas chambers, crematoria, and mounds of ashes. This would make Majdanek unique, the first major Nazi death camp liberated intact. As Soviet forces closed in during July, the SS began hurried evacuation efforts. Prisoners who could still march were driven westward in chaotic columns, destined for camps deeper in the Reich. These death marches claimed countless lives. Guards shot those too weak to continue, leaving corpses along the roads. At Majdanek itself, the Germans attempted to destroy incriminating evidence. Crematoria were set ablaze, warehouses of stolen possessions looted or burned. Yet the task proved impossible in the short time they had. As Soviet artillery thundered nearby, guards torched piles of documents and tried to raze buildings. But much remained. Barracks, barbed wire, the gas chambers, and heaps of prisoner clothing survived. The evidence of mass murder could not be erased. On July 23rd, the Red Army's Second Ukrainian Front stormed into Lublin. German forces fled in disarray. Within hours, Soviet troops reached the camp. What they found was beyond comprehension. Thousands of prisoners remained, many on the brink of death. Emaciated, diseased, and traumatized, they greeted their liberators with a mix of disbelief and desperation. Soviet soldiers, hardened by years of brutal warfare, were stunned into silence. The stench of decay hung heavy. The ground was littered with corpses and ashes. Unlike Treblinka or Belzec, Majdanek left no room for doubt. The gas chambers still bore blue stains of Zyklon B on the walls. Crematorium ovens were filled with half-burned remains. Warehouses contained mountains of shoes, over 800,000 pairs, piled in grotesque hills. There were 7.7 tons of human ash discovered in pits, mute testimony to mass death. News of Majdanek's liberation travelled rapidly. Soviet correspondents entered the camp within days, documenting what they saw. For the first time, journalists photographed and reported directly from a liberated extermination camp. Images of gas chambers, ovens, and skeletal survivors appeared in international newspapers by late July. The world was stunned, but also skeptical. In the West, some reports were dismissed as Soviet propaganda. The scale of the atrocities seemed too vast to believe, yet Majdanek's existence was undeniable. Unlike Treblinka, where Germans had obliterated evidence, Majdanek stood as a grim physical fact. Allied officers and later commissions confirmed Soviet findings. The camp was real, and the horrors were not exaggerated. Survivors who staggered out of Majdanek after liberation carried with them stories that defied comprehension. They spoke of selections, gassings, and shootings. They described watching family members marched to their deaths, the constant hunger, the brutality of guards, and the endless roll calls in freezing weather. Polish survivors testified to the camp's role in crushing resistance and terrorizing the population. Jewish survivors, few in number, bore witness to the extermination machine that had claimed hundreds of thousands before them. Their voices, captured in Soviet reports and later in war crimes trials, became vital in documenting the Holocaust. The Germans' failure to fully destroy Majdanek meant the Allies now had irrefutable material evidence of genocide. Gas chambers with piping still in place, Zyklon B canisters scattered nearby, crematoria with bones and ashes, all stood as proof. The warehouses of stolen goods revealed the industrial scale of the killings. Investigators documented lists of victims, examined execution sites, and measured the capacity of cremation ovens. Majdanek became a case study in systematic mass murder, and its evidence would later be presented at the Nuremberg trials. For Lublin's population, the liberation of Majdanek brought both relief and horror. Locals had long whispered about the camp, seen the smoke rising from chimneys, and smelled the sickly odour of burning flesh. Now they were confronted with the full truth. The camp became a site of pilgrimage, mourning, and testimony. In the months following liberation, Majdanek was used as evidence in Soviet propaganda, but it was also preserved as one of the first Holocaust memorial sites. Survivors returned to lay flowers, mourn loved ones, and tell their stories. For the world, Majdanek's liberation was a turning point. It shattered any illusions about Nazi occupation and revealed the industrialized scale of their crimes. Later discoveries at Auschwitz and other camps would deepen the horror, but Majdanek was the first undeniable proof. The Nazi regime had built factories of death. Majdanek's survival into July 1944 was a historical accident, an accident that ensured the world would see with its own eyes what Nazi extermination meant. While hundreds of thousands had perished within its barbed wire, its liberation gave the dead a voice. The ashes in its pits, the shoes in its warehouses, and the skeletal survivors at its gates became witnesses for history. Majdanek forced the world to confront the scale of Nazi crimes, and it remains one of the starkest reminders of how quickly civilization can descend into engineered barbarity.